with ways to connect artists to communities and building bridges of understanding between West, East, and places in between. Speaking today about Handmade in a Digital World, please welcome Elizabeth Briel.
Sawadika. Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right. I'm here to tell some stories about paper today, about paper and on paper. Most of us today don't really need paper to communicate anymore. We communicate through various media, the internet, electronically, and it's so much more fast and effective than communicating on paper. So recently I was asking, well, who still uses paper? Who makes it? And what do they do with it? I'm an artist, and artists tend to look for opportunities in places that are a little bit unexplored. 150 years ago, photography revolutionized the way that we saw the world. It revolutionized communication. In the art world, it revolutionized painting and continues to do so today. Artists had the opportunity to really work with paint, to play with it, to play with perception in ways that they had never been able to before in the West, because they had been kind of locked into this way of seeing things. With photography, they didn't need to do it anymore. And I believe the same is true today, that now that we have digital ways of communicating, we can really play around with traditional ways of communicating. So recently I went on a journey through Southeast Asia, talked to these paper makers, and here's a little bit of what I found. So in Southeast Asia, they make paper from all sorts of different interesting materials. Here are some banana leaves drying in a Chiang Mai workshop. Okay. Banana leaves, and then here you have some bamboo. Bamboo is a traditional paper making material through Asia. What I look for my paper is mulberry trees. Mulberry trees have been used for paper in Thailand for 700 years, and they last for 500 years at least or more. And this is what I'm looking for out of my handmade paper, something that's going to last a long time, that my collectors can know is going to be a good investment for them, and mulberry paper is the best material to be using. So this is Supan Promsen. He is probably the finest paper maker in Southeast Asia, and I found him up in Lampang. He'd been written about before, but he's really a true master craftsman. He explores everything about paper making with the patience of a scientist. He's a former physics teacher. He speaks English. He communicates through digital media, and he's really amazing about what he does. In his studio, he experiments with papyrus, with bamboo, with all sorts of different materials. Here is his storeroom, where he has hundreds and hundreds of bales of what's called sa, the mulberry bark, and it's drying in his studio there. It comes from Laos, most of it. So he takes the bark and then he cooks it for a while. Then he beats it in this machine, which is called a Hollander beater. It's a modified version of a machine that was invented in Holland several hundred years ago, well before there was electricity. Then he takes these screens, which are made of bamboo and cotton. He dips them in the paper pulp, which is the bark and the water mixed together, and then he makes his paper. So this is some of the artwork that I have made on the paper that I ordered from him. This paper is 50% bamboo and 50% mulberry, and it's about 2 by 3 feet. So this is from a series that I call The Calendar Girls. It's based on my experiences living in Asia and being a little uncomfortable, as you can see from the shoe. The Chinese in the painting means Western bound foot. So a Chinese word for shoes, Western style shoes like this that can deform a woman's foot, is called Western bound feet. This one, the world's oldest occupation, is a woman wearing a Korean style baby carrier. And I often feel that the people who work in what's often called the world's oldest occupation, they always had a mom who worked really hard. Sure. This is the paper that was used for that particular piece. Supan, he pressed the hemp into the paper to give it some texture. And so it's like a canvas, but it's a lot more flexible. This one was a response to the shelves and shelves of whitening skin products that you see all over Asia. A lot of the artwork I make is because something pisses me off. And this pissed me off, so I made a piece about it. The original model for this, this woman's face was a woman in Hong Kong about 100 years ago who had her face all powdered up and her eyebrows probably shaved off and painted on. And I was working in a studio in Hong Kong. I had no air conditioning. I was really hot and sweaty, and so I tried to imagine what she was feeling like during the summertime. This one. This one is from the Two Girls brand, which is a Hong Kong style. It's a Hong Kong brand that's very famous locally there. The two women are kind of holding one another like this. And I said, well, what if I crop it a little bit, take their eyes out? How would that change the gesture? And it becomes kind of a suggestive gesture. You have aphorisms instead of their lips. And then on their clothes it says, good girls, in Chinese characters. This one is my response to sometimes a Western attitude that says, well, in Asia they have things like a bride price. In these primitive societies they have things like a bride price. But what is a Western engagement ring but a bride price? And this one is a response to, I suppose, the kind of the tyranny of children in the modern urban landscape around the world. In China, they have the little emperors phenomenon, which is a single child of two parents who has a lot of pressure, and they're often spoiled as a result. So they're often called little emperors, whether they're boys or girls, because they do tend to dominate the family focus. On the ground, the tiles are painted with two phrases in Chinese. One is kowtow, which is bowing down, usually to your ancestors or to someone who's superior to you, and the other is little emperors in Chinese. So after Thailand, looking for paper again, I went to Laos. And Laos is one of the probably the most heavily bombed country in the world. And I went to Phon Savan, which is in northern Laos, which is the most heavily bombed part of the country. This is my guide next to the village where his parents grew up, which has been totally bombed out of existence. So near there, they have paper makers who are working, and they work on a much smaller scale than in Thailand. Very much individual producers who they use small amounts of bark. They do everything by hand. They don't use machines. They beat it with the mallet. It takes a really, really long time. This is Mei Jiaosang. She's a Hmong woman who, all day long, she beats her bark, and that's what she does. She makes really nice mulberry paper. She asked me where I'm from. I told her, oh, my family lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. That's where I grew up. She said, oh, I have a nephew who lives there. He's a politician. It's such a small world. There's a big Hmong population in the Twin Cities because a lot of refugees came over. And so she receives twice yearly payments, and they're really important for her to keep doing what she's doing. She has a concrete floor. She has dentures. She's really, really well off. And she used to be a farmer, but now she's doing this, which is much more relaxing for her. So I went outside, and I saw that one of her paper makers was using a piece of equipment I had never seen before. I said, what is this? She said, oh, my dad kept it on after the war. So I looked more closely at it, and this was a case for bomb fuses. And you have here the directions how to use it. So this was dropped from the sky from some American plane in Laos about 40 years ago. And they kept it, and this is what the paper makers do in this village. They all use them, bomb fuses, projectile bits of containers to make their paper. And this is pretty common around Phon Savan. You find people using bits of old ordnance to get on with their lives. This is a light at the hotel where I stayed, made of an old projectile. This is a village where they use these cluster bomb casings. It's actually very useful for them. Each of these cluster bombs fell from the sky, split in half, and then the ordnance covered the size of 3 football fields. So if you can imagine the destruction that had on the country. This is a rocket used as part of the banister. This cluster bomb is very useful for a fence. This is for a granary. It keeps the rats from climbing up because the rats would like to eat the grain, but they can't get purchase on those. And this is my keychain from my hotel. It's an old bullet. This is also a cluster bomb. They're growing chives in it. You see this a lot on the roadside. It's very, very useful. So this is how she used her bomb fuse casing to make paper. I call the paper bomb paper because it helps me remember it, and it helps me kind of categorize it with all the paper makers I saw. So she takes this tool, she mixes water and the paper pulp that she saw the other woman beating. She spins it around with this spinner. And it was a really good way to refine the pulp and to make it into something more easy for her to use. And I'll show you how she uses it. This is called the casting method of paper making. So she spreads it out. With her fingers, she moves it around so it's all even. This takes her quite a while. It's actually a very time-consuming way to make paper. And then she lifts it up. This is a huge paper making screen. It's much bigger than most of the Thai paper makers use. She brings it over to the side of the yard, dries it in the sun all afternoon, and then she removes it with a spoon. And the spoons are made with aluminum from old bombs that have been recycled in the village next door. So this is all kind of a symbiotic in terms of how this works. And so I asked them, what did they use the paper for? Sometimes the mainland, the lowland Lao, they use it to make books, but these people tend to use it more for ceremonies, to communicate with the spirits of the houses. So they have it up for good luck, they have it for coins, and they burn it to talk to the spirits. I guess the spirits don't have email addresses yet. So when I saw this paper, I said, this is the perfect paper that I need for this series that I had been wanting to print for about a year. It's a series of sacred places in Vietnam. So I traveled up and down the Vietnamese coast about 2 years ago, taking photos of places that were sacred for one of many reasons, and I'll show you a few of those pieces in a sec. But this is how I print these pictures. They're called blueprints or cyanotype photos. It's a 19th century photo process that develops in the sun. It's kind of an unusual way to print photos. So I take an original digital photo, then I invert it in Photoshop, print it out onto a negative, mix up a couple of chemicals like ferric ammonium citrate, ferrocyanide, which sounds really bad, but they're actually quite non-toxic. And then I paint the chemicals onto paper and I develop them on my Bangkok rooftop. So this is my Bangkok studio, developing in the sun. It takes about 20 minutes, depends on how cloudy it is. There's so many variables in terms of how a print turns out. And here's a close-up shot of what it looks like. Every print is different. I use a paintbrush to apply the chemicals. I do that on purpose because I'm a painter, and I really like how every print is different. It's totally different from the mechanical reproduction that we're used to in daily life. Then I rinse it off, usually in the big shower that the studio has, but also sometimes when it's raining. This is an old Thai house, so the water just comes right in. So I rinse it in the rain. This is a picture of it rinsing in the rain during monsoon. It's actually the best way to rinse the paper. So this is what the final print looks like, but every print will be different. Some will be more detailed. I like this one because it's more abstract. So here's some more pictures from that particular series. These are artist proofs, so you guys are the first ones to see these. And these are what I'll be printing on the bomb paper, because the bombs that were dropped on Laos were really directed at Vietnam. So these are pictures of some places that have various kinds of meaning in Vietnam. This is dirty dishes in a monastery in Vietnam. I like that, here you have the sacred and the human working together. This is a sacred cup of coffee. So here you're at the sea. Sometimes you'll see just an offering to the sea. It's a sacred cup of coffee for the people. This is an offering, so they don't have any problems. This is the headlight from a car from a monk who immolated himself in 1963 in Saigon to protest the regime's how they were dealing with Buddhism at the time. And it's in a museum in Hue, and it's considered pretty sacred. This is a Buddha statue I saw in Hue, also in central Vietnam. And they were propping up the chin with some bamboo because they really wanted it to stay together while it was being put together. This is from an island in the Mekong Delta called the Coconut Monk Island. That's what I call it. This coconut monk who lived on coconuts for 3 years, that's all he ate for 3 years. He had a whole group of people that lived there with him and worshipped and prayed for the war to end and for the many different factions in the 60s and 70s of Vietnam to try and reconcile. It didn't quite work, but if you go to the place today, it's a really kind of sacred and haunted place, and it's totally deserted. This is the last one. This is a picture of a church gate in Sapa. It's in northwest Vietnam. Up there they have many hill tribes who they're doing their thing. There are a lot of Christian missionaries out there doing their work with varying degrees of success and influence. And this is one of those churches. I chose this print because it's like the birds are flying around. So the last thing should be a video playing a slideshow. Well, the video isn't working today, so I will leave it at that. But I really believe that with the combination of, if you have the handmade work and you can spread the ideas with digital technology, it really is the best of both worlds, and I think it can benefit everybody. A lot of these places wouldn't have gotten seen without digital technology, and I think we can all learn from both.
Thank you, Elizabeth.